nurturing in the sense that people are really invested in your growth as a student. So faculty are very invested, and a lot of the sort of rules in place, deadlines and so on and so forth, sound tough and a bit restricting to some degree, I think, as a student. But they're there to help you kind of grow and develop, and I think people are really invested in that.
I'm Agnes Stowicki, Managing Editor with Our Kids. We're speaking with insiders from Canada's leading private and independent schools to bring you insights into school programs, culture, traditions, and leadership. This includes insights from parents, alumni, and administration. This is the Our Kids Insider Perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of the school and what I appreciated about the most, I think speaking again generally about the school first, I would say the level of academics was probably the one thing that in hindsight, and back then in hindsight, something that I appreciate the most. It's certainly top notch. I think it really prepared me well for college studies afterwards. I think especially the social, I can't remember what it's called now, but social studies, I suppose, department was particularly helpful in fostering critical thinking and things of that sort. Back then, there was sort of a I forget what it's called, but it's like an open learning space by one of the lower floors of the school, and that's sort of where the social studies department was. It was sort of had lots of whiteboards, doors can open and close, and so you can move around rooms very easily. And the idea there is to kind of create a space that where it's easy to collaborate across different classmates, across even different classes. If I think the my year was big enough that you could have like two social studies classes happening simultaneously, if I'm not mistaken. So, but the general point is that a lot of the courses are set up so that you're not just sort of memorizing facts, you're not just memorizing things that might be useful, but rather kind of really thinking critically and creatively about how to apply these things. What are the assumptions behind whatever concept we're learning. And I think that more than the facts that I learned was extremely helpful for when I eventually went on to college and graduate studies right now. So that's what I will say about the school in general. I think the other thing that I really appreciated, and this I think is particularly true of boarding life, is the community, the sense of community that's built among students and even among faculty members or teachers. In boarding, we had, obviously we all lived together, but we had a whole suite of sort of weekday programming, weekend programming that I think really brought people together. And I think some of those connections that I built during my time in boarding, especially, have lasted even until now. And so that I think was a really, really valuable experience for me. Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis on sort of, to I guess to put my own spin on it, sort of civic leadership is different. We had at that time, sort of these six core values that were sort of used in material throughout the school's marketing and also certainly throughout the school's programming. I think back then, sort of a lot of us were sort of a bit dismissive about it, as in, this is just a slogan, whatever. We would make jokes about how there are like 3.5 core values because nobody can remember what the six are. And in fact, I probably don't remember off the top of my head what all those six are. But in a real way, I think that teaches you really valuable skills and really valuable attitudes about how to use the privilege that you have from going to such a top school as St. George's and using that to do good in the world. I think that's really important. And even if we don't remember like the specifics of what those things are, I think for me at least, I think it's been ingrained in how I think about a lot of things and how I practice and go about my life. So integrity and humility are two that I remember. That's certainly been extremely important for me. Humility, for example, has been extremely helpful in my work as a researcher because you need a lot of intellectual humility to acknowledge that you don't know something, that you need to look for more data and more information, and that leads to kind of better research as a result, right? And then integrity of sort of making sure you're constantly reflecting on whether this is the right thing to do, what are the implications of what you're doing, how can it help other people. That of course has been really fundamental to how my career is shaped up. I ended up working in the foreign aid and humanitarian aid space. And so I think those lessons, cheesy as it might sound from the perspective of, uh, an 18-year-old or even, especially the younger grades, I think with the benefit of hindsight, I can say was really these values were really important, and certainly something that I don't think I've quite seen in other schools before. So I would say that's one really important thing that distinguishes Saints. Yeah, I don't know if I can list off three off the top of my head, but one of them would certainly be uh, uh, nurturing, I would say. And that's not to say, nurturing as in life is easy, like, academics are easy, or, nobody's ever on your case if you're behind on things. Nurturing in a sense that people are really invested in your growth as a student. So faculty are very invested, and a lot of the sort of rules in place, deadlines and so on and so forth, sound tough and a bit restricting to some degree, I think, as a student. But they're there to help you kind of grow and develop, and I think people are really invested in that. So I think that's a very valuable experience and very valuable environment to be in, and certainly provides one with a lot of opportunities. So that's one. I'll have to go back to the other two, so maybe we can skip ahead to the next question. But that's what I'll say off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good question. I think, obviously everybody will have different sets of interests, but I think that's actually one of the things that's really nice about the school is that it supports a breadth of different kinds of activities of interests, from science to band to theater, to various kinds of athletics. So there's a space for everyone to pursue whatever it is they're passionate about and to find community in doing so. And I think it's a very by and large non-judgmental zone. So I think you're there are lots of opportunities for people to connect over whatever it is that they're passionate about. That so I think it's quite easy to find your community in a school like this. But I would say sort of in general, what connects the students. I mean, it's hard to put my finger on what exactly sort of what the concrete sort of manifestations of this are, but I get the sense that school spirit is very much a thing at St. George's. I think people really take pride in sort of in that identity, in that community, the broader community of St. George's um, that they're in. I remember when I was in that must be grade 11, we had sort of a winter hamper drive, I think. So the idea is that community, kind of alumni, parents, and community members around Saints would sort of donate their donate materials to be donated to sort of those who are in economic need, and then sort of other members of the community kind of drive and pick them up and deliver them to shelters and so on. I think that's how it worked. And I remember when I was kind of volunteering there was a really wide range of people participating in this hamper drive in various capacities. So of course you have your students, you have your teachers who are there kind of helping in various capacities, but you also have custodial staff donating and delivering. You have kind of staff working at all levels of the school. You have kind of parents, alumni. So that I think sense of pride and belonging in that broader Saints community was quite evident in a lot of ways. So I think, that it's again, it's hard to kind of pinpoint like tangibly what's sort of driving that per se. But I would say that that's sort of what the sense that I got. And I would suspect a lot of people that you talk to would probably say something similar. Yeah, I mean, I think I hinted at this before. There were the six core values that, again, admittedly, I don't remember every single one off the top of my head. But I would say that broadly speaking, I think the general thrust of all these core values is to create an educational environment where students are not just equipped with the skills to succeed in life in their professions, but also to use those skills conscientiously to contribute to something kind of greater to themselves and to kind of go about pursuing their goals in a sort of constructive, conscientious manner, right? So again, some of the core values I talked about are really important in emphasizing those values. Again, I think people will pursue sort of all kinds of careers, some kind of more explicitly oriented towards public service than others, perhaps. But in general, I think these values are still relevant because you need to, because I think it's extremely important that whatever it is that you do as a career, right, you're sort of making sure you're doing it in a conscientious ways, in a way that values other people and their contributions as well. So I think that's what I would say is a general mission. I mean, I guess the motto, I don't know if they've changed it, is sort of building fine young men. And I would say that that's sort of my interpretation of it, right? Is sort of making sure that we kind of go about our lives after St. George's in a way that's sort of conscientious and sort of mindful of the impact that we have around us. Sure. I think one thing that was at least surprising for me, coming from the public school system, transferring into St. George's, was that I hinted at sort of the communal how strong the community is. But one thing that is surprising is that that also extends to relationship between sort of teachers and students. I think when I sort of thought about St. George's as a private school, everyone wearing uniforms, and the professors or the teachers are called sir, and as is the norm at the school. You sort of the image that kind of pops up to your head is sort of one of a very hierarchical school, and to some extent there are clear lines of hierarchy, right? You have to respect your teachers, you have to and there are sort of like these prefect systems, right, where you have kind of student leaders in a very formal way with certain responsibilities. So I'm not denying that there's that. But what I am surprised by, or what I was surprised by, and I think many others might, is that despite that, there's a real sense of connection and closeness, even between teachers and students. Again, not all students with all teachers. I mean, obviously, you get along better with some people than others. That's just life. Um, but in general, I was surprised at how close those relationships can be, right? It could be something as simple as, I think, again, I don't know if this is still the case, but we used to share the same gym, basically. Like the teachers would work out there after school, same with the students. And certainly in boarding, right? You spend a lot of time together with the we called them house parents back then. Even on weekend excursions, you would usually have one house parent be the sponsor that tags along with the students. So you could be, going to watch movies together or playing laser tag together, right? You could literally be, shooting lasers at one of your teachers. So, I think that's one thing that I found surprising with that stereotype in mind of sort of a very hierarchical place, and then realizing that actually you can develop really close relationships, not just horizontally with other students, but vertically with teachers and administrators as well. And I think that's really valuable. Again, at the end of the day, you still have to have some boundaries, right? They are your teachers and kind of professionals, but I think the level of closeness was certainly something I didn't experience kind of prior to coming to Saints. Yeah, I think a lot, very, very much. I think I sort of stumbled on Saints as a transfer student by chance. So it wasn't like, it wasn't a planned thing at all. But and the things that I did while I was at Saints were also not planned. So I was very involved in the boarding house weekend activities. Weekend activities, and then eventually student leadership. None of that was planned. I sort of just wanted to find a good school with strong academics where I can kind of learn a lot. But I think the exposure to those kinds of roles, I think I'm was and still am very much an introvert, but I think that experience really brought out kind of some leadership skills and develop some leadership skills that I don't know if I would have developed otherwise. And at least in my case, in a very organic way, because in what I did, at least it was sort of boarding house leadership, which in a lot of ways means sort of spending a lot of times and socializing with other students and organizing weekend activities and things of that sort. So it was very organic. It was mostly things that were kind of already fun to do and so on and so forth. But I think that that was really important because I think before that I sort of never really had in my mind this idea of being a leader or sort of kind of being civically engaged, other than kind of just generally being attuned to news and what's happening in the world, but not really thinking about how I'm impacting any of that or kind of taking a role in shaping um, kind of what's happening around me. And that sort of was brought out by accident through Saints. But I think that's had a really important role in how I kind of developed my career in public service, in wanting to contribute to the issues that I care about now. So I would say that's a big way that it's affected me. Then of course, academics were great, so obviously gave me lots of opportunities for college applications, for being competitive for some of the kind of more selective schools and so on and so forth. I think that you'll probably hear that quite commonly, but for me at least, the leadership component was the big one. Yeah, I mean that's a tough one. I think I had a really great experience overall. I will say maybe a couple of things I'll mention. One is again, I think overall there's a pretty strong sense of community in the school, but there are at some times sort of a bit of a divide between, say, boarding house and day students, in that the boarding students would kind of form their own groups and maybe is a bit harder to interact and socialize with sort of the day students. Now um, there's a um, there's a common denominator there in that a lot of the boarding students are, of course, international students, and so maybe there are cultural differences. Not just it's not the boarding versus day school that's driving this. It might be kind of the cultural differences there, but I think that it certainly was the kind of that divide was there. I think at times, perhaps we could have done more to kind of have more day student boarding joint activities, so inviting more day students to come to boarding house activities, things of that sort. I think we might have tried something like that. I can't remember how far it went, but that's certainly one avenue. The other one is, I think, within the boarding house itself. I think again these are all sort of marginal things at the end of the day. I think, like I said, I had a great experience, but I think for some of the boarding students we had. I think some people weren't as active in boarding activities, partly because they just kind of went home on the weekend, and then kind of came back during the weekday when they had to be in the boarding house. And again, as is their right if they're able to do that, but to some extent, I think it's a bit of a shame because you don't kind of get that full boarding house cohort that you might have if everybody kind of stayed and did more activities together. What else would there be? Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would say off the top of my head. I'll let you know if kind of anything else comes up, but those are kind of the main ones I could think about. Actually, one more thing, and maybe this ties to the next question. One of the next questions about sort of how my perspective of the school has changed over time. Um, I think in many ways over time I've kind of grown to appreciate the school more and more, and sort of what the kind of values it's instilled into me, right? As I've kind of been talking about for the past 20 minutes now. But as I kind of ventured out in the world and kind of saw more perspectives, kind of interacted more people, I think the question of sort of where St. George's sits in sort of structures of privilege in Canada and perhaps internationally as well is, I think, an important question for us all to be thinking about. And what I mean specifically is, obviously St. George's is a very elite institution, with admittedly unparalleled resources that could be really beneficial for us as students. But it sort of begs the question of, what our role is in sort of socioeconomic inequalities in the long run, right? And that's not just a St. George's question. It's true of, private institutions and certain, private elite institutions certainly. But I think it's one thing that I'm sort of reflecting more and more as I kind of work more in sort of contexts where a lot of these opportunities are really shouldn't be taken for granted. And it sort of helps in, it leads me to reflect on kind of what Saints as a community, as an institution, can do to be more inclusive, to kind of promote opportunities for other people who might not have those opportunities otherwise, right? I mean, I would say to some degree, I'm certainly a beneficiary of that, right? I come from a low income immigrant slash kind of international background, and I was able to go to Saints because of a generous scholarship package that they offered me. So and then I think that's really had a big positive impact on my life. So I'm extremely grateful for that. But I do wonder if sort of those are kind of the directions that Saints should be kind of thinking about more consciously as well, and trying to expand the ability to kind of afford those opportunities to others as well. So that's one kind of food for thought, I guess, that I would leave for this interview. Yeah, I mean, that's a big one that I just mentioned, right? Like thinking back then it was a lot more, wow, this is amazing. It's done so many great things for me. And now it's sort of thinking about what can we do, we as in this broader Saints community of alums, current students, and administrators do to promote a bit more inclusion. So I think that's a big one that I think a lot about. But other than that, like I said, I think with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of the things um, that I found maybe a bit trite or cheesy back when I was a student. I think the meaning of that becomes more and more apparent as you kind of advance in your career and kind of have a chance to interact with people from different environments, right? Like the question of, are you able to be humble in your personal life, in your professional life? Seems like a pretty obvious thing, but then with the benefit of hindsight, again, with interacting with, a broader range of people, it's really not, you can't take that for granted. Not everybody, let's say, will have that mindset. So it's really important to kind of to instill that kind of early on, I think. Yeah, I've been number one. Academics. It's really unparalleled, I think, and really fantastic. So I'd say that alone should be reason enough to at least consider sending their children to school at the Saints. If they can afford it, of course. Given some of the things that I've mentioned earlier about sort of Saints as an elite institution too. That's, I think, one big reason. The second one, I think, is community. And again, not just community among the current cohort or your classmates, but also with faculty, administrators, and certainly with alumni, right? I think Saints, probably more than a lot of other secondary institutions, has a really strong alumni network. And I think the current students and even recent alumni can really benefit from that. It kind of offers opportunities for mentorship, for networking, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really valuable um, resource to have. And then the third one I would say is, again, I think the kind of the focus of mission driven education, I think, is really good, because like I said, it's not enough to have great academic skills, great sort of technical skills that you learn from being at a top school like Saints. You need to also develop a system of values around that to make sure you're putting those skills to good use, or at least not doing harm with those skills. I think the combination of like great instruction, but also kind of a conscious effort to make sure that you know how to use those skills, not just in a technical sense, but also in a social sense, in an ethics sense, I think is really important as well. Yeah, I would say, especially for students who are kind of joining in sort of a bit later years, take advantage of the different resources. Don't be shy. There are lots of things happening at Saints, and lots of resources like alumni, faculty, other students, and so on and so forth. I would say definitely time flies. So do talk to lots of people, do try out different things. I think once you're sort of in the professional world, you'll realize that you might not have a lot of time to do a lot of to have that breadth of experience. So take advantage of it while you can. And certainly if you're one of the earlier years, but especially if you're kind of like me, a kind of late transfer student. So that's really important. I would say too, don't be afraid to take risks. This relates to my previous point that there's a lot going on, some of at school, some of which will be new experiences for you, some of which are sort of maybe um, experiences that you've already had, but not experiences that might push you to pass your comfort zone. So you might have good academics, in from another school or from previous years, but there are always kind of more advanced courses that are available at Saints. If I'm not mistaken, I think a couple of people took courses even at UBC, but and that's sort of, I think Saints helps set that up as well, if I'm not mistaken. But the general point is, there are lots of opportunities, and so don't be afraid to take kind of measured risks, to try out those things and kind of push yourself to grow. That's two. Three, let's see. I think it goes back to kind of the point that you and I were talking about sort of developing relationships with teachers, and um, especially I think you raised a great point, which is it helps as well, kind of with what happens after Saints when you're kind of in university or even in a workplace where I think a big part of being successful is also being able to interact sort of professionally, but also productively with sort of more senior members of that community, be it teachers, be it your boss or whoever it might be. So I think don't be afraid to kind of talk to teachers, right? And sort of develop those relationships. Don't see them as sort of, oh, these authority figures that is just making my life miserable by giving me homework deadlines and rules and so on. But really think of them as resources, who are providing these structures, annoying as they might be, for your benefit. And obviously you might not see eye to eye on everything, but try to understand where they're coming from, try to understand why those things are in place, and how they're meant to help you, and then kind of have a productive discussion from there onwards. I think that's really valuable, and I think that gives a lot of the kind of soft skills that you'll need to succeed later on, once you're in a different setting after Saints. Again, I think it would, the first thing I would say is, if there are families or students out there who are sort of reluctant to apply because it is on paper pricey and sort of, even like living in that area is expensive, that kind of thing, um, I would say don't be discouraged. I think, I don't know again the full details of like what kinds of scholarship and financial aid packages Saints offers nowadays, but at least in my experience, they were quite generous. I, in fact, applied not as a boarding student, but as a day student, because I had already been living in the Vancouver area, but quite far, like maybe 2.5 hours away. And so I applied as a day student, but then Saints kind of generously offered me a position in boarding, and sort of helped fund that as well, because otherwise I couldn't afford it. So I would say for families who kind of think, oh, it might be cool to send my kid to Saints, but the kind of all these considerations are discouraging. Please don't be too discouraged. Like have a conversation, and see, if there are avenues for financial support. At the end of the day, it might not work out. I don't know the full details, but it might also be sort of more generous than what people might sort of think, just off the top of their head, or kind of just seeing things on paper. So that's my one big piece of advice is don't be discouraged too quickly, to apply or consider applying. What else would I have? Yeah, I mean, no, I think, there's, I guess, plenty of advice you could give to families about how to write a successful application, things of that sort. But I'm sure there are other people giving that advice, so I think I'll leave it mostly at that. But yeah, I think, overall, I think it can't hurt to apply. I think it's a really great institution. Obviously, always ways they can be improved. But as things stand, I think it offers a great educational opportunity for students. So, definitely, it would be a great idea to apply if you can.
And going back to the third question, if the school were a person, what are three personality traits it would have? Um, just as a, we can skip this if you don't want to answer, or if like we can skip it. I think we've got plenty. So if you want to answer, definitely. But if you want to skip it altogether, that's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a few things. I don't know if they make much sense, but or they're necessarily different from what I've said before. But I would just say, I mean, I already mentioned nurturing. Again, not in the sense that everyone's like warm and fuzzy all the time, and life is easy and happy all the time. Like, yeah, it can be hard work because the academics are rigorous, and there's a lot going on. And if you join a sports team, for example, especially like one of the more competitive ones like rugby, like, yeah, training will be tough. So it's not nurturing in the sense that everything's warm and fuzzy all the time, but in the sense that they're really doing this to help instill a set of kind of values and skills and habits that would be helpful for you as an individual, right? So in nurturing in that sense. um Maybe the other one I would add is sort of diverse or eclectic. And I've already mentioned this before, which is that there are a lot of activities going on, it seems, lots of opportunities to pursue various passions. And I think by and large you can find, a corner of saints, figuratively speaking, that you can call your home. Just from the diversity of things going on there, right? So that's another one I would say. um, what else can there be? I think I'll just leave it at that for now. I can't really think of a third like catchy personality trait. But I think there's a lot of praise already in kind of my various answers throughout. So there should be some material there.
For more information about this school, you can visit their profile at ourkids.net.